Hello! We are looking at some of the structural components involved in the Olivet Discourse found in Matthew chapter 24. The parallel passages to this, which also follow this pattern, are found in Mark chapter 13 and Luke 21. Now, we've looked in the last couple of videos at the context of what Jesus is saying. In the first three verses, Jesus is clearly talking about the buildings that are visible then, or the second temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. We see that the progression of events that he says, see that no one leads you astray or be deceived, Jesus is talking about what did happen leading up to 70 AD. Now, this includes, of course, the last topic that we had in our last video, which is found here in verse 14, the gospel being proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to the nations before the end would come. And of course, we looked in Colossians 1, verse 23, where it says, the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven in Paul's day. However literally you want to take Colossians 1:23, you can take Matthew 24, verse 14. What was clear was the gospel had gone out through the entire world. So now we are looking at the end, and then the end shall come, the end of Matthew 24:14. So now we are looking at the end. What is this end? Again, we believe that this is looking at 70 AD, the destruction of the city and the Jewish nation, really. Breaking the power of the holy people, as it says in Daniel 12, verse 7. So we have to look here at the next verses of Matthew 24, starting at verse 15. It reads, this is Jesus speaking, so when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, this is spoken of by many in the futurist camps, believing that this is all speaking of a future time and not the first century. This is spoken of the futurist camps, that this abomination is the sign that we must watch for in the future. Of course, it is the sign that they were told to watch for here. Now, this phrase, abomination of desolation, is echoed in two of the accounts. The other account, in Luke chapter 21, says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So Luke uses a different reference, but these two refer to the abomination of desolation. Now, right here, we see that it says, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. As one teacher put it, I liked the way he put it. If you're wondering whether Daniel was a prophet, you can settle that in an instant if you just read Matthew 24. Jesus called him a prophet. That should be enough for all of us, right? But the point here is this abomination of desolation, and this is referred to in Daniel. Now, some people claim that it was referenced 4 times in Daniel. I see 3 references. I do not see 4 references. But the 3 clear references, not counting Daniel chapter 9, the last verse there, I don't see a reference there. Or it's not as clear, certainly. The language is similar, but it's not quite. But we see one in Daniel chapter 8. We see one in Daniel chapter 11, and we see one in Daniel chapter 12. And in the Why Preterism series, I go into some of these in greater detail as I'm going through systematically through the book of Daniel. But basically what we see is when we look at the Daniel 8 and the Daniel 11 abomination of desolation, these are clearly happening in the third empire of the series of 4 that were represented throughout the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7 represent these series of 4 empires, represented as the statue and the 4 beasts. And in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, both of these are represented in the third empire. Now, this happened historically with the emperor Antiochus Epiphanes, who was part of Greece, the third empire of Daniel's progression. In the other videos, we make a longer case, which we'll only make reference to here. But in Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, the reference to the abomination is to Antiochus Epiphanes. It is fulfilled. But Daniel 8 says that after a certain period of time, the temple will be cleansed and the temple will be restored. This leaves, again, not counting Daniel chapter 9, because we don't see that as a clear reference to the same thing. But Daniel chapter 12, we're talking about a different abomination. We see two abominations. We see the historical one. Clearly, Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are the historical abomination, the Antiochus Epiphanes. And so Jesus here is referencing another abomination. Now, this is drawn clearer as one studies Daniel, because, again, the Daniel 8 abomination of desolation says after a certain period of time, the temple will be restored. However, in Daniel chapter 12, as one puts the pieces together there, it says, after a certain period of time, the power of the holy people will be utterly shattered. Further, this also puts it into the last kingdom, and one understands that the scope of Daniel is punishment for 70 years. That's how it starts out. But then by Daniel 9, they haven't repented, and so you get the Leviticus 26, verse 18, sevenfold increase of punishment. So they went from 70 years of punishment in Babylon to 77s of years. If you study out Leviticus chapter 26, it talks about, if you do not obey me, verse 18, I will add 7 times more punishment to you. And so the scope of all of Daniel up through 12 is, I will break the power of the holy people, which is this 70 AD destruction that we're talking about. Now, I realize that's a lot. You can go back and look at some of the other videos, or if you want, ask questions, or just get a hold of me somehow and just ask questions. I don't mind that. But the abomination that's going on here, so you see, it says, let the reader understand, the one spoken of by the prophet Daniel. The abomination in this day was already a well-known fact. In that day, they subverted the priesthood, they subverted the Temple Mount, and the ultimate culmination of that was they placed an idol of Zeus on the altar of sacrifice in the outside portion of the temple. Now, the book of Maccabees actually calls the statue there the Abomination of Desolation, but the book of Maccabees is not an inspired book. That does not define the Abomination of Desolation. That's simply what that book called it, but that book is not scripture. It's a history book. We can read it and gain some insight into some of the events. But the Maccabees is not an inspired text. It is not the canon of scripture. What did happen is, in this period of time leading up to 70 AD, the exact same thing happened. The Temple Mount was subverted. The priesthood was subverted. They didn't end up setting up a literal statue in there, but that was simply a symbol of what was going on. The thing that brought the desolation in both accounts was the complete subversion of the place of worship. Was the house of God, the priesthood of God, the leadership of God was completely subverted, and it was standing in the holy place. The rebel leaders, when they decided to declare war by ceasing their daily offering to Caesar, they actually set the rebel leaders, some of them set their headquarters up in the very temple of God. And so you see that this apostasy and this love growing cold that we just talked about, this has taken the place of the worship. The only thing that made Israel special, if your presence does not go up, then we will be just like all the other nations of the earth. And so the thing that is happening here is the very temple of God and the place of worship is replaced by warring, rebellion, loveless apostates. And so the other interesting thing to note is that at this same time, when they ceased these sacrifices to Caesar, these daily sacrifices, this was seen as an act of war. That's why they took over the temple. And the Romans actually sent soldiers. One of the Roman generals came, and he actually came up to the city gates and stopped. He hung out there for a couple of days, and for no apparent reason, turned around and ran towards the Mediterranean. The rebels, of course, pursued, killed a bunch of them, but even the historian Josephus says there was no real reason for them to withdraw and fall back. This was such an obvious defeat that it actually encouraged the Jews to rally to fight. The Jews were grossly outnumbered, but when they saw that they defeated a single legion, when the legion just turned around and ran, they said, "Look, we can win. We've got this thing." But what this also did is it fulfilled the other sign that Jesus had given in Luke chapter 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. then flee. Whoever, don't go back for a coat. You who are on the rooftop, he says, just get out as fast as you can. And so what do we see? We see the abomination of desolation, the taking over the place of worship, and the subverting it to rebellion, apostasy, and lawlessness. We see Jerusalem surrounded by armies at the same time, and the other sign mentioned in Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, was the ceasing of the sacrifices. It was the exact number of days. I don't have that exact number of days, but the number of days in Daniel chapter 12, and that number of days until Jerusalem fell. It was the exact day count. And so you see, what Jesus is referencing here, it isn't the principle of dual fulfillment. There is no principle of dual fulfillment here. It was two different abominations referenced in Daniel. Daniel 8 and 11 are both clearly in the third kingdom. Daniel 12, simply by looking at the text, and with the help, of course, of Jesus' reference to it, the first desolation says, after so many days, the temple will be cleansed, being restored. However, the Daniel 12 one says, after a certain number of days, the power of the holy people will be utterly shattered. These are two different events. And so, when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. This is where he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what in his house. And let those who are in the field not go back and take his cloak. You have to understand, these were desperate times. You've got all these rebel Jews that are pursuing these Romans. You do not have very much time to get out of the city. What is actually the case is they say that perhaps no Christians died in the war and in the siege that came to Jerusalem. Why? Because they all fled. God had prepared a place for them in the wilderness, and they fled across the Jordan. Many historians, or some historians, point to a city called Pella, where they believe that the Christians went. A very large number, I believe over 100,000, fled from Jerusalem and from that area, and they all fled to a city across the Jordan, where they would be isolated from the conflict that would come upon Jerusalem and Judea, and they were preserved because they heeded Jesus' warnings. And this is the context of what Jesus goes on to say. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing in those days, pray that your flight not be on the winter or Sabbath. Of course, the reference to Sabbath here is a clear indication that this is the first century, because the warning on the Sabbath does not have the same importance. We are not in a Jewish culture. This is for the Jews here. And we'll skip this. We'll wait on this next verse. Or we'll just touch it real quick. For there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world till now, no, nor ever be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of those elect, those days will be short. What is this talking about? Of course, Matthew 24:21, there will be great tribulation. This is what people refer to as the Great Tribulation. Good news, this was in 70 AD. It was. Everything else fits. Everything else was accomplished. As we'll look down to the rest of the chapter, all of that is taken care of too, in a perfectly understandable and very clear way. But also some people like to say, well, will this ever happen again? Couldn't there be a dual fulfillment? Well, again, the principle of dual fulfillment isn't really scriptural. There was no dual fulfillment with the abomination of desolation. Second of all, right here it says, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Well, this says right here, it will not happen again, so you're certainly not going to get a dual fulfillment on this verse. A lot of people like to take verses like this, no human being would be saved if that had not been cut short. Well, you have to look at context. Many people want this verse to be a global context, saying no person in all of human in the entire planet. Well, it doesn't necessarily say that. It's simply popular interpretation. It's simply modern theological people, very sound people, very respectable people, but people bring their own interpretation to the text. And the only thing we're interested in is the text. And so when it says, if those days had not been cut short, we're still talking about the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. No human being would have been saved. Yes, if the days in Jerusalem had not been cut short, no one left in Jerusalem would have been saved. And that's all this is saying. So we hope to continue this with another session. Thank you very much.